Paris, France, 1712. The Sulpician priests are attempting for the first time to obtain la seigneurie du Lac des Deux Montagnes. Unfortunately, a year earlier, in 1712, King Louis XIV had declared a moratorium on granting application on all seigneuries in New France. 2 years later, the Sulpicians made another attempt that was also rejected by the French government. September 1st, 1715, Louis XIV dies. Louis XV, his grandson, who is only 5 years old, becomes king. The power of the kingdom is then transferred to his uncle, Philip, Duke of Orleans, who is the closest family adult of the deceased. Philip names the future Cardinal de Fleury tutor of the child. It is de Fleury who will be responsible for his education until his majority. After the death of Louis XIV, a family quarrel begins. The Duke of Orleans invalidates the king's will. The government leaves Versailles and the Duke governs the kingdom from his home. New France is not a priority and the future seigneurie du Lac des Deux Montagnes even less. The Duke takes charge of the royal court and leaves the burden of ruling the parliament to de Fleury. It was probably at that time that the Sulpicians came into action and pressured de Fleury to get the seigneurie. It was finally given to them on October 17, 1717, and ratified on April 22, 1718. The Sulpicians had good reasons to be proud of obtaining this concession, despite the moratorium. They probably discussed the argument for the welfare and protection of their savages. Montreal, 1704, Mission de la Montagne. The mission was located on the actual Sherbrooke Street at the corner of Dufaur Street, just west of Côte-des-Neiges. At the mission, there was a 10-year-old boy named Josiah Rising. Josiah was taken captive during a massacre in Deerfield, Massachusetts by Jean-Baptiste Hertel de Rouville. Josiah was adopted by the Mohawks, who gave him the name of Shontaquani. As for the Sulpician priests, they changed his name from Josiah Rising to Ignace Rezen. Ignace and his Mohawk brothers lived happily at La Mission, when the Sulpicians strongly exhorted them to move away from the city to Le Sault-au-Récollet on the north side of Montreal, where the priests operated a mill. They agreed to their demand and left La Mission de la Montagne with their wives and children. As they arrived at Le Sault-au-Récollet, they settled on the land that the priests had given them. There, he met Abigail Nims. She was also captured during the Deerfield Massacre and adopted by the Mohawks, who gave her the name of Toatogouache. The Sulpicians changed her name to Elizabeth Nims. The Indians lived very well at Le Sault-au-Récollet. They had huge land that they cultivated. They lived here for about 15 years. During those 15 years, Ignace and Elizabeth became adults and got married. They had 4 children. After obtaining la seigneurie du Lac des Deux Montagnes, the Sulpicians realized that they needed manpower to clear the land. They decided to move their Indians from Le Sault-au-Récollet to Oka. The priest told us that once again we had to move with our families because it was no longer appropriate for the Indians to live on the island of Montreal. If we agreed to do so and establish ourselves in the new seigneurie du Lac des Deux Montagnes, we would have hunting and fishing territories, beautiful and large land that we could cultivate. And all this would be the courtesy of the King of France. More, we would have the ownership of this land by deeds executed by a notary. This land would belong to us and we would no longer be disturbed in our homes. To make sure that they would never have to move again, on behalf of the Indians, the chief accepted the agreement, stating that the territory would be there forever. For the white people, a property deed was the European way to regularize a property issue. As the Indians could neither read nor write, the Sulpicians never gave them their notarized deed or writing. The Indians also had to enter in this agreement on their own terms and in accordance with their traditions. They manufactured a wampum belt that they exchanged with the priests when they moved. By doing so, they were equal as both parties had reached a friendly and suitable agreement. This belt was called the two-dog wampum. Several years later, the priests of Saint Sulpice said that they never promised land to the Indians, and they also denied having in their possession the famous belt in question. That the Indian lied and that the belt never existed. Furthermore, the priest told anyone who would listen que la harangue des sauvages n'a pour but que des fables de leur génie. That could be translated by what the savages said is pure invention from their part. In the book Les Sulpiciens de Montréal, written by Dominique Delandre, John A. Dickinson, and Olivier Hubert, there's only a few lines on this subject. Here is what the book said. La teneur des tractations pour convaincre les Iroquois et Algonquins de quitter le sceau récollet n'est pas connue. Y a-t-il eu promesse qu'ils jouiraient de la propriété des terres comme le veut la tradition orale iroquoise? It could be translated by the content of the negotiations to convince the Iroquois and Algonquin to leave le sceau récollet is not known. Was there a promise that the Indians would be owner of the land like it is said in the Iroquois oral tradition? Ironically, when the seminary helped the authors to write the book, they seem to have forgotten whether they gave the land or not to the Indians. From the beginning of this adventure, the Sulpicians priests of Paris told the Sulpician priests of Montreal to give absolutely nothing to the Indians. That was done, and very well done, until now. 1721, it's the big move. Ignace Chantaquani, his wife Elizabeth Toatogouache, their 3 children, and their Huron, Nipissing, Algonquin, and Mohawk brothers embark on a never-ending nightmare. The Sulpicians decided to close the Sceau Récollet and move the mission to Oka. The move is made in February because it is easier to walk on the frozen rivers in winter. The missionary and all the people of Falaret, including Abigail Nims, Josiah Rising, and their 3 children, starts walking the 30 miles or 45 kilometers to Oka. They have snowshoes and are pulling the toboggans. They bring everything with them. Even the little chapel is taken apart and carried on the snow. After crossing all the west end of the island of Montreal, they reach the village of Sainte-Anne-de-Bellevue. The caravan heads north on the Lake of Two Mountains toward the final destination, the northwest bank of the lake, where they will find the new seigneurie du Lac des Deux Montagnes. La seigneurie du Lac des Deux Montagnes is a huge estate. The limits are Saint-Eustache on the east side, Saint-André d'Argenteuil on the west side, and from the banks of the Lake of Two Mountains up to Saint-Colomban to the north, and Saint-Jérôme on the northwest side. The living quarters of the new mission are built gradually. They first settle in the small bay west of the Snake River, after near the stream named le Ruisseau de la Coulée. Today, this stream is named the Raisin Stream in honor of Josiah Rising, but they soon realized that it would be better to be closer to the point, and it is at this place that in 1760 the priests start building a church, a dwelling for the missionaries, and a house for the employees. As for the Indians, they settle down each side of the church, each nation having their own quarters. On the east side, the Algonquins and the Nipissing, and on the west side, the Huron and the Iroquois. As for the Rezem family, with their hybrid status, not exactly European, nor exactly Indian, they obtained by the missionary a large estate about 1.5 kilometers or 1 mile north of the village. This is where Ignace, Elizabeth, and their children will be able to settle down. Who are these Sulpicians? Les Messieurs de Saint-Sulpice is an elite order of the Catholic Church, founded in 1645 by Jean-Jacques Ollier. The Sulpicians are not under the jurisdiction of the diocese and are not financially supported by the parishioners. Unlike other religious orders, the Sulpicians do not make vow of poverty. They remain owners of their personal effects and belonging and are free to dispose of them with a will. The Sulpicians are not linked to the community. Quebec had many Sulpician priests. The most famous were Cardinal Paul-Émile Léger, Bishop of Montreal in the 50s and 60s, also Cardinal Marc Ouellet, Bishop of Quebec City in 2000. Cardinal Ouellet moved to Rome after he was promoted by the Pope Benedict XVI. His new job in Rome consists of presenting to the Pope future bishops. In 1763, the seminary went to the British governor Ralph Burton to complain about the sale of an Iroquois to the British merchant, stating that the Indians were the property of the seminary of Saint-Sulpice. Governor Burton agreed to the demand, and the sale of the Iroquois was cancelled. The Indians remained the property of the priests, just like any common item. From 1721 to 1761, there is little information on La Seigneurie. After the conquest, when the French lost Canada to the British in 1761, a development in Kahnawake on the south side of Montreal exacerbated relations between the Catholic Church and the British. A dispute arose between the Jesuits who managed the mission at Sault Ste. Louis and Kahnawake over the sale of land by the priests to the settlers. The Jesuits were selling land owned by the Kahnawake people. The Indians took the matter to the jurisdiction of the British Crown military, and General Thomas Gage settled in their favor. The Jesuits had to give back the land to the Indians, and the priests were forced to leave. The possibility that the seminary of Saint-Sulpice would be forced to give up its land in Montreal and Oka Kanesatà turned real, and present threat with the Thomas Gage judgment against the Jesuit. So alarmed were the Sulpicians by this decision that fear drove them to try to incite the people of Kanesatà to rise up against the British. Likely, their action in this instance were motivated by the desire to alienate the Mohawks from the British, though reducing their influence. However, the people of Kanesatà would have nothing to do with this scheme, and the British were unequivocal in their condemnations of the seminary. After this incident, the seminary developed a new strategy to keep the Montreal and Oka seigneury. In April 1790, the seminary of Saint-Sulpice in Paris, in whose name the French king had granted land in New France, transferred all its properties to the seminary of Saint-Sulpice in Montreal. Also, to make doubly sure that they would keep their land in New France, all the priests of Saint-Sulpice in Montreal swore an oath of allegiance to the British Crown to demonstrate their loyalty. The British gave tacit approval, and the seminary was able to keep both the island of Montreal and the seigneury of Two Mountains. By the 1920s, the people of Kanesatà were already laboring under heavy restrictions from the seminary. Any Indian harvesting more than he needed for his family could not use his profit to buy the use of more land. In addition, any Indian who left the mission to live at any other post where there was no missionary would lose the right to his land. The Sulpicians also tried to dictate what the people of Kanesatà could and could not read. 1826. The Sulpician priest Jean-Baptiste Rup, superior of the mission, banished marriage between Indians of Kanesatà and white people. He also banished marriage between Indians of Kanesatà and Indians of Kanawake and Akwesasne. Furthermore, he refused to bury Indians that were living together as couple but were not married. He also refused to bury those who were alcoholics. The 1837 French rebellion against the British, the people of Kanesatà were in a much worse condition than their French-Canadian neighbors, not having even the right and privilege of the habitants. They decided to remain neutral in the conflict, refusing to fight on either side. On one hand, the seminary officially remained loyal to the British, and on the other hand, priests openly agitated against the British and incited rebellion. One such example was l'Abbé Étienne Chartier, curé of Saint-Benoît, who by the way was not a Sulpician. Since 1835, when he came to Saint-Benoît, his voice rolling out from the pulpit and dominating public meetings, he had been first a recruiter of patriots and then a call to arms. We don't know much about l'Abbé Chartier, but we know that in the 1704 Deerfield massacre, there was 2 Carters taken captives, Samuel and John Carter, who both remained in Canada and married. We also know that the priests changed their name to Chartier. The patriots were fighting the British, but they were also fighting the seminary. The Sulpicians were facing open revolt against the seigneuries. In Montreal, anti-clerics such as Louis-Joseph Papineau, a leader of the rebellion, were equally hostile to the seminary. In 1838, he called for the outright abolition of the seigneurial system and the annulment of the seigneurial debts. The seminary was so afraid of the patriot invasion during the year of the rebellion that they burned many of what they considered to be incriminating papers. Indians are poor, wrote the superior of the seminary in 1848. It is because they are indolent and naturally lazy. In 721, when the Indians moved from Montreal to Oka, the seminary promised them large hunting and fishing ground. In 1848, all those promises were gone because the white man now had settled on most of their hunting grounds. After all the hunting and fishing ground had disappeared, the Indians turned to cutting and selling wood as a way to earn much needed income. Almost immediately, the Sulpicians tried to put a stop to the activity. Most of the wood cut by the Indians was sold across the river at Vaudreuil and Como. In March of 1848, as they were in process of cutting and selling wood, 12 Belize Canadians, hired by the Sulpicians, came to the village to carry out the arrests and threatened to kill the men if they offered any resistance. The charge, cutting wood without the permission of the Sulpician priests. The Indians were arrested and jailed in Montreal for 8 days. The seminary was quick to respond and wrote 3 letters to the Governor-General, Lord Elgin, defending their action. The wood on the seigneury was the property of the seminary, said the Sulpicians. The seminary's arguments apparently carried more weight with Lord Elgin than did the petition of the Indians. After investigating the allegations, he concludes that the Indians have no just cause of complaint against their missionaries. Furthermore, Elgin agreed with the priests that the wood upon the seigneury is the property of the seminary of Saint-Sulpice, and the Indians have no right to cut down and sell any portion of it without the consent of the priests. Reading of a bulletin posted everywhere in Oka and Kanesatà around 1870.
Avis important, défense rigoureuse, est par la présente faite aux Iroquois, Algonquins, Canadiens et autres personnes de quelque origine que ce soit, de couper du bois de chauffage, du bois pour faire des cercles ou toute autre espèce de bois sur le domaine du lac des Deux-Montagnes appartenant à messieurs les ecclésiastiques du séminaire de Saint-Sulpice de Montréal, sous peine de confiscation du bois coupé, de poursuites judiciaires contre ceux qui le couperaient, le charboieraient, le vendraient ou l'achèteraient. Source: Archive of the Seminary of Saint Sulpice, Drawer 42, File 147.
At this point, the Algonquins and the Mohawks wrote up a petition that most of them signed. The language of the petition angered and exasperated the Sulpicians. They considered it blasphemous. Immediately, action is taken against those who had signed it, and in April of 1852, following a request from the superior of the Sulpicians, the Bishop of Montreal, Monseigneur Ignace Bourget, who by the way was also a Sulpician, imposed the severest punishment that the Roman Catholic Church had to offer. 15 Mohawks and Algonquins, mostly chiefs, were excommunicated. The pressure on the Mohawks and the Algonquins must have been tremendous. Several months later, the chiefs signed a public retractation for the use of improper and offensive language against the Sulpicians. 5 months later, in September of 1852, Monseigneur Ignace Bourget lifted the excommunication. Another event occurred in 1851, which further angered the Sulpicians. For the first time, a person from another religion came to Kanesatà. Reverend Peter Jones, an Ojibwa and ordained Methodist clergyman, visited the village at the request of the Methodist Church. He came with a view to converting the Indians to the Protestantism and spent several days in the community. He was not successful, but the Sulpicians took a dim view of the visit, saying he was an individual interested in fomenting the troubles. In 1854, the Seigneurial Act was abolished. At this time, the Seminary of Saint-Sulpice gained full ownership of all the lands not yet given by the priests. The Sulpicians gained control of thousands of acres of land, including Kanesatà and the village of Oka. Also, the land and the little house that they gave to Ignace Shuntakwani and his wife Elizabeth Toatoguash back in 1721. The name of Shuntakwani was changed by the priest to Rezen. Charles Leclerc was the third generation of Rezen living in the little house. For the people of Kanesatà, the nightmare continues. The white people were censitaires and were given the option to claim full title of the land on which they lived. The Indians were not censitaires and therefore could make no claim to the land. Even the Canadian Minister of Justice, Rodolphe Laflamme, a lawyer who was educated by the Sulpicians, wrote, "It is impossible that the Indians have any right to the land. They never had any right before the abolition of the seigneurial tenure, and they certainly have not acquired any legal claim since. The Indians and their ancestors were on the land before the seminary arrived in Oka in 1721. And had never left it, yet they had no right to make a claim. On the other hand, settlers who had to come to the seigneury in the 1820s and 1840s had full right to make a claim. The people of Kanesatà were the only one affected by the abolition of the Seigneurial Act. The land on which the people had lived since time immemorial became off-limit to them. In the years to come, the Mohawks, Algonquins, Hurons, and Nipissings would be subjected to an infinite number of rules and regulations drawn up arbitrarily by the seminary. Any resistance by the people would result in arrest, fines, and imprisonment. Nothing went unnoticed to the Sulpicians. The Indians were stopped at every turn. The Indians are squeezed into ever smaller squares of land in which they plant their meager crop. At the same time, the Sulpicians took more land. They also restricted almost everything the Indians did to earn a living. By the 1860s, the Sulpicians are enforcing the rule of, by the permission of the seminary only. The Sulpicians complained that the Indians were indolent and naturally lazy. But when the people tried to earn money, the seminary rushed forward like a hawk on its prey and seized goods and profit. Here is an example of this policy. Jean-Baptiste Lacopre made a canoe and sold it. To his shame and embarrassment, the Sulpician missionary Joseph Alexandre Baye, superior of the seminary, gave the order to seize the canoe from its new owner. According to the priest, the Indians were allowed to make canoes but could not sell them without the permission of the Sulpicians. Joseph Alexandre Baye, who was educated in France, wrote a letter to Hector Langevin, then Minister of Indian Affairs, and told him that if the savages wished to stay on the land who was owned by the priests, had to obey politely the rules that they made explicitly for the welfare of the savages. Langevin agreed with the priests. He also wrote to the Indians telling them to obey honestly the laws of the seminary. Here is another example of the attitude of the priests toward the Indians. The widow Petitcrie, who had 4 children, decided to lease part of her land to a farmer in return for part of the crop. The Sulpician simply stopped the arrangement and leased the land to someone else. The man whom the woman had leased the land was a Canadian, and he could not, said the Sulpicians, establish himself among the Indians without the permission of the seminary of Saint-Sulpice. At the same time, the Sulpicians had other Canadians working on 22 farms which the seminary operated. In 1870, a new group of people took the cause of the Mohawks. The group was made up of Methodist clergymen and missionaries. 2 men, Reverend John Borland and Reverend Amand Parent, took up the case of the Indians with force. Borland would do the battle with the federal government and the seminary of Saint-Sulpice, while Parent did its best to help the people of Kanesatà. Both men were fiercely anti-Catholic and made no attempt to hide their feelings. In 1871, an arrest struck John Borland, an Indian who was making barrel loops and selling them in Montreal. The Sulpicians tried to enforce the no woodcutting rule. Sapling was used because it was flexible and easy to work. The priests cut all saplings. The seminary ordered the Ottawa River Navigation Company, which operated steamboats, to stop shipping the goods. One Indian, who was determined to get his hoops to market, made a raft and floated downriver to Montreal. Arriving in Montreal, his hoops were seized by the priests and the Indian was put in jail. In 1872, Mr. Gabriel Kanesatà was arrested for cutting wood to build a stable. The priests promptly sent their men to confiscate the timber despite the fact that Mr. Kanesatà had made an agreement with the seminary to cut wood for building purposes. He took a suit against the seminary for trespassing on his land. Naturally, he lost his case. Later, in 1872, he was arrested again for cutting logs to make shingles. The priests were angry against him for leaving the Catholic religion, and this was the cause of all his problems. By 1874, with the help of Reverend Amand Parent, the Methodists built a chapel. The chapel also doubled as a school. The seminary was outraged. They argued the chapel was illegal. In December 1875, the priests had the chapel demolished. During this time, more than 40 incidents where Indians were arrested for cutting wood without the permission of the priests. The Mohawks were not allowed to cut wood to heat their houses or to repair them. They could not make snowshoes. In those days, everything was made out of wood. One could imagine the nightmare those people went through. At this time, the Indians were speaking Iroquois and French. It is probably then that they start losing the French language for the English. As for the Nipissing of Oka, we have very few information about them. All we know is that some of them probably left with the Algonquins in Maniwaki, some of them probably left for Muskoka in Ontario, some of them stayed with the Mohawks, and most of them died in the 1835 cholera epidemic. Since the end of the 1700s, the priests wanted to get rid of the Indians. Later, in the 1800s, all the Algonquins were deported from Kanesatà to Maniwaki. The priests had no more use for the Indians. What they wanted was their territories. Even more, they became cumbersome. With this move, a band of new missionaries who came from Marseille in France, les Oblats, who were subsidized by the Hudson Bay Company, took over from the Sulpicians to help the Indians. To dominate the Algonquins, les Oblats came up with a simple, tried and tested technique and also terrifying plan: the fear of going to hell, an unknown concept for the Indians. The Algonquins finally gave up to a superior force. For the Mohawks, the seminary came up with another plan. They wanted nothing less than the complete removal of the Indians, or that they cease to exist as a nation. Here is an excerpt from a play done in 1999 regarding the departure of the Mohawk people by the Sulpician priests from Kanesatà to Muskoka, Ontario. early April 1881, the Sulpicians had convinced the federal and Ontario governments to move the Mohawks to Gibson near Muskoka in Ontario, a distance of about 280 miles or 550 kilometers from Oka. A delegation was sent to Muskoka to inspect the new reserve. To get rid of the Indians, the priests promised them, if they move, 60,000-acre reserve, new schools, the government to provide health care. Each family would receive one cow, one horse, and one bull, the clothing necessary for 3 years, $10,000 per family. Finally, after the move, all they had is $3,000 per family. For the rest, they were on their own. Finally, in the fall of 1881, the wish of the priests was granted. 39 families fell in the trap. The deportation took place on the 22nd of October. Charles Cook, 11 years old, who was among those leaving, later recounted his impression of that day. I remember the afternoon of the 21st, we bid goodbye to our home in the country. We moved our belongings to the village, so as to be ready the next morning. We spent the last night at the house of François Jacob. Us youngsters slept on the floor. The next morning, we were on the wharf 3 hours before the boat named Dagmar was due to leave. The 5 roads leading into Oka were crowded that morning with people with mixed feelings, some on curiosity bent, over with sad heart to bid farewell to their loved relatives, other with a jeer on their faces that they were not sorrowful that these Muskoka-bound travelers were at last shaking the dust of Oka off their moccasins. At last, the 3 whistles of the steamer blown to signify she was about to leave the wharf.
All aboard!
I remember a fiddler who brought his fiddle to the wharf and was to play a selection to make the Muskoka lot feel sorry for leaving Oka. Oral tradition also recalls that a priest stood on the shore watching the people depart. He was overcome with weeping. One concerned individual inquired if he was sad to see them go. To this the priest replied, "Yes, I am sad. I am sad because too many are still here." The trip to the township of Gibson took approximately 10 days. The people traveled up the Ottawa River on a barge that was designed to carry freight and animals. From Sainte Anne, they boarded a train for Gravenhurst. Some families stayed in Gravenhurst for the winter. The rest traveled to Bala by steamboat. The lack of roads to the reserve required travel by raft over rapids to reach their final destination. They arrived at Gibson with little more than the clothes on their back and nothing more than tents for shelter. The people may have had great hopes and expectation for their new home. What they encountered was extreme deprivation, hardship, and famine. Under the terms of the Order in Council passed by the Canadian government, the Sulpicians were required to build substantial log houses for each family. Naturally, the priests did not fulfill the promise, and the Indians were left with no help. A few hours after the Iroquois had left Muskoka, les Messieurs de Saint-Sulpice, with a group of polices hired by the priests, along with 40 French Canadians, attacked a house that was deserted by the people who left for Muskoka and taken over by family. Armed with sticks and axes, the police and the French Canadians beat severely the people in the house, including 4 women. The wife of Pierre Beauvais, who was pregnant, was so severely beaten that she had many ribs broken and almost died. the seminary gave the order to seize all houses abandoned by the people who left for Gibson. Later, those houses will be sold to white people. This will have for effect to divide the Mohawk territory. All this strangely resembles the deportation of the Acadians. The red section shows the land owned by the Mohawks today. In 1721, when the Indians came to Oka with the Sulpicians, they owned the yellow section, but slowly the Sulpicians stole the land and sold it to white people. The Algonquins and the Mohawks probably did not know that they lived in a new country named Canada, and that both of them and their territory were now the property of the federal government of Ottawa. They probably did not know what right they had, and even less that they had none, because a new law was just voted in March of 1876. This law makes them inferior to the white man. This confirmed their legal incapacity and are considered as minors, or children, that the government can dispose of their goods and rights as he wants and when he wants. Their real name was taken away from them. They will have a number that will be entered in a register. A woman who marries a white man will lose her Indian status, along with her children. She will have to leave the reserve and will not be able to be buried in the Indian cemetery. Those who wish to stay on the reserve will have a roof over their heads, a school, and a food ration. Meanwhile, back at Oka, in 1933, the Fathers of Saint-Sulpice borrowed more than $1 million from the province of Quebec. Later, they claimed that they were unable to pay back the loan. So they gave 100 lots to the province for a total of more than 1,550,000 acres. Numéro d'enregistrement for this deal was 7667. In 1941, Bernard Bourdon, counsel for the trustees of the commercial properties of Saint-Sulpice, contacted the government with a proposal to sell them land occupied by the people of Kanesatà. Several years earlier, the seminary had sold large tracts of land, including the commons, to the Belgium syndicate. Later, in 1945, the Canadian government bought back the land sold by the Belgian for a total of 550 acres. Numéro d'enregistrement for this deal, 4157-120. At this point, it is clear that the activities of the seminary had left the Indians of Oka with almost nothing. In the 50s and 60s, the Sulpicians and the city of Oka took all the land they could from the Indians and their descendants. Ignace Shuntakwani and his wife Elizabeth Toato-Gouache were given a large estate on le Rang de l'Annonciation in Oka back in 1721. Later, the Father of Saint-Sulpice changed their name to Rezen. The descendants of the Rezens stayed on the land for 232 years. They cleared the land, cut the trees, built the house, and paid the taxes, and were always loyal to the priests. In 1971, Wilhelmine, who was the fifth generation of Rezens to live on the land, decided to sell the estate to the municipality of Oka. Big mistake. The priests decided to block the sale of the land and declared themselves owners of the estate. In those days, in the province of Quebec, the all-powerful Catholic Church had all the clout it needed for this seizure. The Sulpicians went to the Superior Court, and with the help of the judge, Bernard Bourgeois, obtained a court order and seized rising land. Here are a few excerpts of the court judgment number 61063. This court, after studying the written case of the skillful attorney, judges that the plaintiffs are justified to ask Wilhelmine Rezen to clear out. This court declares that the plaintiffs, which are the Sulpician priests, were always and are still the only real owners of the estate. Order is given to Wilhelmine Rezen to clear out of the estate and let the plaintiffs, who are the Sulpician priests, the free ownership with no itch of any kind, and this in the 15 days of the notification of this present judgment. At this point, we can observe a few words. Clear out in 15 days. This means that the descendant of Ignace Shuntakwani and his wife Elizabeth Toatoguash, who lived in this house for 232 years, were never the owner of the house and had 15 days to clear out. Of course, the Sulpician priests won the lawsuit and took the house from the Rezens. Wilhelmine, who was born and raised in the house of her ancestors, was finally evicted by the Sulpician priests. She also lost the profit because she was unable to sell the house. She moved in Oka in a rented apartment. When the Sulpician priests seized the house from the descendant of Ignace Shuntakwani and his wife Elizabeth Toatoguash, they sold it. The new owner, instead of demolishing it, renovated it. To date, this house is the oldest one in Oka, Kanesatà. One day, the owner decided to plant a tree. He made an astonishing discovery. He found a human skull. The rest of the skeleton still is in the ground. It is a woman's skull. It is possible that the remains are the one of Elizabeth Toatoguash. Only anthropologists could tell. In the late 50s, the municipality of Oka decided that it would construct a private golf club on the pines of Kanesatà. The municipality's plan would take a large chunk of the pines and reserve it for the exclusive use and benefit of the membership of the Oka Golf Club. In 1959, the municipality of Oka obtained a private members' bill in the Quebec legislature that enabled them to begin construction. This was easily done because the private bill was introduced by the Premier of Quebec, Paul Sauvé. The people of Kanesatà were given no notice of the bill and had no chance to fight it. Legally, the bill could have been dissolved within 1 year by the federal government, who did nothing to stop this private bill. From 1600 to 1990, the Indians were moved from La Mission de la Montagne in Montreal to Le Sault au Récollet, moved again to Oka, Kanesatà, beaten, excommunicated from the Catholic Church, humiliated, forbidden to sell goods, forbidden to sell their crops, forbidden to cut wood, even to eat themselves. They had their church destroyed, deported to Maniwaki and Muskoka in Ontario. In the 1940s, the Sulpicians sold a large tract of land to a Belgian syndicate. Later, the provincial government had to buy back the land. In the 50s, the seminary seized 85 acres of land that they had given to the Rezen back in 1721. The owner, a woman, had 15 days to leave the house. In 1959, the provincial government expropriated their land to make a golf. In 1990, the municipality of Oka, with the help of Mayor Jean Ouellet, decided again to take the land from the Indian to expand the golf and destroy their cemetery. But this time, the Mohawks were ready when the elite SWAT team from La Sûreté du Québec attacked them. Finally, to submit the Indians, the federal government sent in the Canadian Army with more than 1,500 troops, tanks, and helicopters. Up to this date, nothing is settled.